Hey folks, Attorney Andrew Branca here from Law of Self-Defense, coming to you from Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, specifically the Ambassador Hotel in Oklahoma City. Very nice hotel, I have to say. I would recommend to stay here if you're staying in Oklahoma City. It's quite nice. And of course, I'm traveling on my way back home from the Carry Trainer S12 self-defense gun medical grappling training event, 4-day training event I just taught at outside of Nashville, Tennessee. Expect to be home shortly. But in the meantime, I'm recording these, pre-recording these shows, or law self-defense shows, in the hotels along the route. And today is one of those. And we're going to be talking about a Florida Man event. Florida Man, this happened last Thursday, specifically November 9th, in Hillsborough County, Florida. Ralph Bouzy, apparently having a mental health crisis, that's why police were called to his home, ambushed several of the responding officers by using his speeding car as a deadly weapon to cause several of the officers critical injuries. At last report, there was a good chance one officer would actually lose a leg. It's hard to get much more serious bodily injury than that without achieving an outright fatal outcome. After ramming the police with his car, Bouzy then exited his vehicle and advanced on the officers, including one officer who was seriously injured on the ground, seriously injured in this ramming attack, laying on his back. Not that it should matter, but this is the racially energized world in which we live. Bouzy is black, a large black man, and it appears that at least some of the officers involved were white. Maybe not all of them. It's kind of hard to tell from the video. Ultimately, the officers took Bouzy into custody using only their non-deadly force tasers to compel Bouzy's compliance with arrest, and Bouzy is now charged with 3 counts of attempted murder. Not the first criminal charges in Bouzy's life, as we'll see. The question arises, however, whether any one or perhaps several of those officers involved would have been legally privileged to have used deadly force upon Bouzy, specifically their service pistols, rather than limiting themselves to their non-deadly force tasers. And I saw quite a bit of argument about this on Twitter, on X, so I thought it would be a good topic for discussion. Now, we do have video of this event, both from a body-worn camera, from dash camera, from surveillance camera, apparently on a nearby home. And I expect, at the very least, YouTube will age limit this video. So if you're a law self-defense member, of course, the unedited, unrestricted, unabridged version of today's show will be on the blog post. If you're watching this in more general social media, I'm not sure what they'll do. Now, there's no gore in the video, but you will see police officers struck by a car. So it's a pretty dynamic attack by Bouzy here. And that's what we'll be discussing in today's show. So with that out of the way, let me go ahead and formally launch today's show. All right, and before we jump into things, I do, of course, have to mention the sponsor of today's show, which is none other than Law of Self-Defense itself. Our best-selling book, Law of Self-Defense Principles, we'd like to give you for free. This is your handbook to how to be hard to convict if you're ever compelled to use force in defense of yourself, your family, your property, all based on actual law, not internet myth. I encourage you to check out the book on Amazon, 5-star rated, best-selling in its category. Read the reviews. They're quite positive, but don't buy the book on Amazon. Amazon will charge you for the book, plus shipping and handling. We only ask that you cover the cost of shipping the book to you. We'll cover the cost of the book itself ourselves. And you can take advantage of this opportunity at lawofselfdefense.com/free book. Right there, lawofselfdefense.com/free book. And I'll put a banner on the bottom of the screen here too. There we go. So let's take a look first at the news report of this event, and then we can look at the video. And for this, I guess I need my glasses. Let's see if I can make this a little bigger for all of us. So headline, man who intentionally hit 2 Hillsborough deputies faces attempted murder charges. The 2 Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office deputies who were nearly killed Thursday morning by a driver, that would be Bouzy, who intentionally hit them with his car, remained hospitalized on Friday. His Hillsborough County Sheriff Chad Chronister called the incident an ambush by Ralph Bouzy, the driver. The suspect was formally charged with multiple felonies by a Tampa judge on Friday morning. Corporal Carlos Brito and Deputy Manuel Santos were responding to a mental health call in Brandon, that's a city in Florida, when investigators said Bouzy deliberately ran them over, leaving both critically hurt. They're now at the hospital recovering. The sheriff released a photo of Deputy Santos in the hospital. He suffered a broken leg, which will require surgery. Fox 13 was told Corporal Brito's leg may have to be amputated, but doctors are monitoring his progress and doing everything they can to save his leg. So, a leg that may need to be amputated and a leg that requires surgery. Does that qualify as serious bodily injury? Obviously. Does serious bodily injury put this force by Bouzy into the deadly force bucket? Yes. The definition of deadly force for use of force law purposes is force that is likely to cause death or serious bodily injury. It doesn't have to actually cause serious bodily injury. It has to threaten serious bodily injury. Here we actually have, as a result of Bouzy's attack using his car, obviously serious bodily injury. So Bouzy was using deadly force upon these officers, incontrovertibly. Bouzy has been charged with 3 counts of attempted murder of a law enforcement officer, and prosecutors want to keep him locked up until his trial. The judge withheld bond for Bouzy and has scheduled a bail hearing for next Wednesday, November 15th. Imagine letting this guy out on bail. This isn't Bouzy's first run-in with law enforcement. Oh my gosh, no kidding. His criminal past is lengthy, and records show he had 18 mental health cases. It's not even his first time ramming a car into police. Back in 2015, he attempted to ram his car into a deputy's vehicle during a hit-and-run incident. Later in 2017, during another hit-and-run crash, he likes using a car as a weapon. He attacked a police officer during his arrest. And later that same year, his family called police after they feared for their lives after he attacked 2 family members. Records show his family told officers they tried to get him help for his mental health issues, but Bouzy refused to take his medication. During that same incident, he intentionally headbutted a deputy and injured him. In some of his criminal cases, Bouzy entered into a pretrial intervention program rather than facing jail time. Records show other charges were dropped. Does anybody believe this guy's going to self-heal and stop being a threat to the community if just left to his own devices? Amazing. So that's the news report. Let's go ahead and take a look at the actual video now. 44 seconds. Again, there's no gore, there's no blood that I was able to see. But Bouzy does ram his car into 2 police officers, causing serious bodily injury. So it's pretty dynamic. So if you're uncomfortable watching, now would be the time to depart. Here we go. Oof.
Get out the vehicle right now! Right now! Get out the phone! Get on the ground now! Taser, taser, taser! Get out of the ground right now!
Okay, so terrible. You hear that screaming in the background. Presumably one of the officers seriously injured by this menace to society. So one thing I'd like to note is the taser is actually effective here. Doesn't happen often. But when the tasers work, they work great. And here they worked on Bouzy. So they got good contact. They put the electric shock through his body, and he locks up and falls like a big tree. That's how it works when tasers work properly. Unfortunately, I see a great many cases, maybe half or more, where tasers just don't work. So they're not very reliable, in my opinion. Now, I did meet a fellow, just a recently retired police officer at this S12 training event I was just at, who felt quite differently. He was a big fan of tasers. I will say that he was also a taser instructor for his department. So he's basically a professional taser user. And for someone who's at the highest echelon of training for tasers, tasers may be more effective in his hands. So he may have had a more positive experience than the lesser trained, more typical officer with a taser. But in my experience, I see tons and tons and tons of taser videos, and in at least half the cases, the taser doesn't work. So fair caution. But here it works, so that's good, right? I do think officers should have a taser on their belt as an option, because when it works, it's wonderful. You don't have to shoot that person, and if you don't have to shoot them, that's a more positive outcome than if deadly force is required. And at least in the police setting, typically, often, there's more than one officer present, as here. So you can have an officer making the effort with a taser backed up by an officer with a pistol in case the taser doesn't work and deadly force is required. So you can have an instant deadly force backup. That doesn't really work in the civilian sector, right? I mean, most of us, if we find ourselves being threatened, we don't have a cop standing next to us. We don't have a second person on our side armed with a pistol to back us up. And there's only so much stuff we can carry on our belts, right? So most of us are, you got pepper spray. You already have all the usual stuff, right? A phone, keys, a pocket knife, pepper spray, maybe a spare mag, your pistol. How much stuff are you going to carry on that belt? Maybe a tourniquet. It starts to add up if you're a civilian. You don't have that giant duty belt that uniformed cops have that's made to carry a heavy load. So the taser worked, so that's good. Now the question arises is, could these officers have used deadly force and not just non-deadly force? And I see a lot of people on Twitter saying, no, they couldn't use deadly force because he was no longer presenting as a deadly force threat. Now, it is true, of course, that when you're asking the question, what degree of force can I use? That's a question being asked at a particular moment in time. You're about to use force. How much force can you use depends on the circumstances that are presenting themselves at that moment in time. And the scenario here is dynamic. It varies, right? So there are different circumstances at different moments in time in this video. And in some of those circumstances, the conditions for deadly defensive force are met. And in other circumstances, they're not. So I'm speaking specifically here, not just to the question of proportionality, which has to do with how much force the officers can use. That's a function of how much force they're being threatened with, but also the element of the 5 elements of self-defense, folks: innocence, imminence, proportionality, avoidance, and reasonableness. We're addressing, of course, proportionality, but also the question of imminence. At any particular moment in time, is Bouzy presenting as an imminent threat, either imminent deadly force threat or imminent non-deadly force threat? At those moments in time when he's presenting as an imminent deadly force threat, the police would be privileged to use deadly force. And in those moments when he's not presenting, he may be presenting as an imminent threat, but maybe only a non-deadly force threat, then the police would be privileged to use only non-deadly force in self-defense. Or, absent a threat, they could use non-deadly force to compel compliance with lawful arrest, which is really what they're doing here when they discharge the taser effectively in this case. A related question is, each officer, of course, has to make their own independent use of force decision. So it's possible that some officers might have a privilege to use deadly force in self-defense and not others. I mean, that's not really possible, but it's theoretically possible. So we'll address that question as well. And what's important to keep in mind with imminence is like a window. It opens and closes. And proportionality also varies. It can be non-deadly and then deadly, and non-deadly and then deadly. The threat can be imminent and non-imminent, imminent and non-imminent. The window opens and closes, and you're only allowed to use force when the threat is actually imminent, when the window is open. Not before the window's open, not before the threat has become imminent, and not after the threat's no longer imminent. And how do we evaluate imminence? Well, a great framework for that is something called the AOJ triad: ability, opportunity, jeopardy. This is often taught as if it were the entirety of a claim of self-defense. It's not, folks. The AOJ triad is a wonderful framework for evaluating one of the 5 elements. Again, the 5 elements are innocence, imminence, proportionality, avoidance, and reasonableness. 5, up to 5. The AOJ triad is a great way to evaluate one of those 5, the element of imminence. That's all it does. And anyone who's teaching AOJ as if it were the entirety of self-defense law that you need to know is generally, they're either ignorant of the other elements or they're just assuming that the other elements are satisfied, because typically they're a self-defense or firearms instructor who's teaching a class of law-abiding students. So they're just assuming that you would not be the initial aggressor, so you'd have innocence, that you would retreat from the fight if you safely could, so you'd have avoidance, that you wouldn't use excessive force, so you'd have proportionality, that you'd otherwise conduct yourself reasonably, so you'd have reasonableness. But I can assure you, from a prosecutor's perspective, a prosecutor is prepared to attack each and every one of those required 5 elements, because they only have to defeat one. If they defeat any single required element of self-defense, your claim of self-defense collapses. So you can't just assume that those other elements beyond imminence have been satisfied. You have to be prepared to defend them against attack by the prosecution. But in any case, on the question of imminence, the AOJ triad is very effective for evaluating imminence, both evaluating it in real time, you're facing a threat, isn't imminent, AOJ, and for articulating why your perception of an imminent threat, articulating to others why your perception of an imminent threat was a reasonable perception. The AOJ triad provides a very good articulation, communication framework as well. So, ability, opportunity, jeopardy. 1, ability. Does that other person, the apparent aggressor, do they have the ability to cause harm to an innocent person? Well, we all have some ability, right? We all have at least fists. So we all have at least the ability to cause, I'm going to pull this down. We all have at least the ability to cause non-deadly force harm. Yes? Whether we can cause deadly force harm depends on facts that have to be evaluated. And that really gets us into proportionality. But for our purposes right now, let's presume that some degree of ability is always present. Opportunity. Do they have the opportunity to bring that ability to bear? Well, if they have a gun and they can see you, they generally have the opportunity, right? That's the nature of firearms. Throws hot pieces of lead very quickly, long distances. So opportunity is generally only an open question when we're talking about non-projectile weapons, when we're talking about contact weapons, things that have to be brought into proximity before they have the opportunity to cause harm. So someone armed with a knife clearly has the ability to cause deadly force harm, but if they're 100 yards away, they don't yet have the opportunity. They have to close to some more proximal distance before they could actually have the opportunity to bring the knife to bear. And jeopardy, the third element of the AOJ triad. Are they conducting themselves in such a way that a reasonable person would perceive that the aggressor intends to bring ability and opportunity to bear against an innocent person? For example, you could be standing next to a uniformed cop with a pistol in a holster. He's got ability, he's got opportunity, but unless he's threatening you, he's not expressing the jeopardy that would be required for AOJ to be complete. When you have all 3, A, ability, O, opportunity, J, jeopardy, then you have an imminent threat against which you can lawfully defend yourself. But if you're missing any one of those, A, O, J, if any one of those is missing, there is no imminent threat. And if there's no imminence, you're missing a required element of self-defense. You could not justify a use of force as lawful self-defense. So what we have to ask ourselves here is, at what moments in time is there ability, opportunity, jeopardy? So there's an imminent threat. And what's the intensity of that threat? Proportionality. Is it merely non-deadly or is it deadly force? By the way, whether a force is deadly is not just a function of the force itself. Deadly force, as I already mentioned, is force that can readily cause death or serious bodily injury. But there are other factors that go into whether it can readily cause death or serious bodily injury than the nature of the force itself. So, for example, a fist, a typical punch thrown from one man at another, where both men are of similar size, strength, and fighting ability, is invariably treated by the courts as non-deadly force. But what if the victim of the punch were exceptionally vulnerable to injury? What if they're on medically prescribed blood thinners? So a punch to the head of a healthy person is unlikely to kill them. A punch to the head of someone on blood thinners can readily kill them. So it's the same punch, but because the target of the punch is exceptionally vulnerable to injury, that punch can be, for that exceptionally vulnerable individual, a deadly force threat, where it wouldn't be a deadly force threat to someone who is not on blood thinners. And there's a variety of ways a person could be exceptionally vulnerable, right? They don't have to be on blood thinners. They could, for example, have had their leg broken by a speeding car, driven by the same aggressor who's now advancing on them while they're laying on the ground, helpless if they don't resort to a weapon in self-defense, helpless from being stopped by a large, violent, demonstrably violent man. It's also important to point out that what self-defense allows you to do is defend yourself, as we said, against an imminent threat, meaning a threat that's either in progress or immediately about to happen. It doesn't allow you to defend yourself against a threat that's over. Makes sense? So if someone uses force upon you and then stops presenting as a threat, you would have no privilege to use defensive force on them because they've stopped presenting as a threat. Yes, they just caused you injury, but you're not allowed to use self-defense for a already caused injury if there's no ongoing threat. That would just be vengeance. That said, if proximate in time, a pretty good reason to believe someone's going to cause you injury moving forward is that they just caused you injury. A pretty good reason to infer that someone's going to punch you a second time is that they just punched you the first time. And absent an obvious indication that they're ceasing their violence, they're retreating or they're surrendering, it would be reasonable to expect that the violence will continue. So all that should be kept in mind as we scroll through this video. So let's go ahead and pull the video back up and see what we have to see. So I'm just going to scroll through. Starts here. Nothing's happening at first, right? I'm advancing the video manually. So there's Bouzy's car, and it's speeding in, not much to see there. But at this point, right here, is Bouzy presenting as an imminent deadly force threat? Well, maybe, but it's ambiguous, right? Have the cops seen the car? Is the car speeding at this point? Is it apparently about to be used as a weapon? But certainly, at the last seconds before impact, there's no question. We can see from the officer's body camera here. Well, this is from, I guess, a home security camera. Here the car comes in. Right there, you see the cop put his hands out. He knows Bouzy's car is coming straight at him. Is Bouzy now presenting as an imminent deadly force threat? Ability, the car. Opportunity, the car sufficiently proximate. It's being used as a giant impact weapon. And jeopardy, speeding directly at the officers. Reasonably perceived as intending to bring ability and opportunity to bear? Yes, if we have AOJ, we have an imminent threat. Is the nature of the threat one likely to cause death or serious bodily injury? Obviously. So we have an imminent deadly force threat. Would the officers be privileged to start discharging rounds into the windshield of Bouzy's car? Yes. They can use deadly defensive force to stop an imminent deadly force threat. So if the question is, would the officers have been privileged to have shot Bouzy at this moment in time, the answer is unquestionably yes, they would have. Now the car struck, hits the cops, causes serious bodily injury. Another view of this. See, the gun's out. He's ready to shoot, just doesn't have time. Does not have time. The attack is too fast. Now, if Bouzy had simply stayed in his car or gotten out of the car and dropped to the ground in surrender, would the officers have been privileged to use deadly force upon Bouzy simply because he drove into them with his car, causing them serious bodily injury. No. The moment that Bouzy no longer presents as a threat, the privilege for the officers to use deadly defensive force is ended. So if the question is, could the officers have shot Bouzy? If he surrenders in this moment, the answer would be no. But does he surrender? Is he compliant with orders? Does he lay on the ground? Or does he continue to advance on the officers? Is he submitting to arrest? No, he's not. And if we look at this particular frame, here we have one of the officers seriously injured. Bouzy's advancing on him. Is this officer exceptionally vulnerable to injury, even by an unarmed Bouzy? Now remember, no one's really unarmed, right? Because we have fists, we have feet we can stomp with. And this officer, either he's got a broken leg that requires surgery, or he's the officer who's looking at getting his leg amputated, right? One of the two officers actually struck by the car. He's already been seriously injured. Bouzy is not surrendering or being compliant with arrest. Pretty good reason to believe, to reasonably infer that Bouzy intends further violence, and he's advancing on this officer who is exceptionally vulnerable to injury, on his back, seriously injured. Would this officer right here with his gun out be privileged to have shot Bouzy using deadly defensive force? Yes, unquestionably. Now, you might argue in 2020 hindsight, well, Bouzy ends up walking past him. So he didn't actually intend to cause this officer more injury, but that's not the question. The officer is not required to let Bouzy decide for himself what he intends to do. The officer is privileged to respond to the apparent threat in the moment. And the apparent threat in this moment is Bouzy presenting as a deadly force threat. If he didn't want to present as a deadly force threat, he could simply surrender. But he's not doing that. Now, this officer does not shoot him. Of course, you don't have to shoot if you have the privilege. You might decide you have the luxury, or you're unwilling, or whatever. So the fact that the officer shot or doesn't shoot does not determine whether or not he has the legal privilege to shoot. Clearly, he does here. By the way, what about the other officers? This is another point of contention. I heard people suggest that, well, this officer could have lawfully shot, but the other officers couldn't because Bouzy's not presenting as a deadly force threat to them. It may be true that he's not presenting as a deadly force threat to them. To the extent he's presenting as a deadly force threat to this officer would be acting in self-defense, defense of himself. But guess what, folks? There's also the legal doctrine of defense of others. And generally speaking, you're allowed to use in defense of others the same degree of force that person would be allowed to use in their own defense. So these other officers, even if they're not personally being threatened, are privileged to use the same deadly defensive force in defense of this fallen officer that this fallen officer would be privileged to use himself. So they also have a legal privilege to use deadly defensive force on Bouzy in defense of others. This officer, if not in defense of themselves. Of course, the situation proceeds from here. It doesn't stay locked in that moment. In fact, Bouzy walks past this officer, advancing. Pretty big guy, right? Pretty big dude. That cop sits up. It's probably got a broken leg. They get the tasers out. And it's kind of hard to tell, really, in some of the images, but it does appear that the officer in the background here appears himself to be a black officer. The officer with the taser appears white. The officer on the floor here appears white, and I'll use white and Hispanic interchangeably. Everyone's got tasers out, and now. At this moment, is Bouzy presenting as a deadly force threat? Probably not, right? He's no longer in a position to threaten the fallen officer, to stomp on his head. He's no longer in the car. The car's certainly inoperable in any case, but he's not in it. He's just an unarmed person who does not have the ability, opportunity, jeopardy, the imminent potential to cause deadly force harm. He's at worst presenting as a non-deadly force threat or simply being non-compliant with lawful arrest for the obvious crime he just committed, the obvious felony he just committed. So the officers are privileged to use force here to compel compliance with arrest and to defend themselves from potential attack by Bouzy, but not deadly defensive force. If one of those fallen officers had turned out to have been killed by the car, would these officers be privileged to use deadly defensive force on Bouzy in this moment? The answer is no. You can't literally use deadly defensive force for something that's in the past, and the killing would be in the past. They can only use deadly defensive force for what they reasonably perceive to be some imminent threat from Bouzy. And at this point, the imminent threat is either only non-deadly or it's simply, of course, officers have the legal privilege to use force also to compel compliance with lawful arrest. And that's what they're doing here. All right, folks. So I think that's everything I have for today. I'll just remind all of you that if you carry a gun, so you're hard to kill, if you carry a knife, so you're hard to kill, if you carry pepper spray, so you're hard to kill, if you practice jujitsu, so you're hard to kill, I do all those things so that I'm hard to kill, so my family is hard to kill. If you do those things, so you're hard to kill, so your family is hard to kill, you also owe it to yourself and your family to make sure you know the law, so you're hard to convict as well. Until next time, probably tomorrow, I remain attorney Andrew Branca for Law of Self-Defense. Stay safe.